G'day folks, and welcome to an on-chain update for the 9th of April. And today what we're going to be looking at is a question I've actually got quite a bit, which is how big are the actual ETFs? And for the most part, this is me distilling the actual question. A lot of people really say that we need to factor out or factor in GBTC because they believe that it doesn't really count because it's not really long-term holder supply. So I spent a bit of time actually thinking about this problem and trying to work out a way that we can really measure it, just put things into a bit of a sense of scale and understand really how big these ETFs actually are for Bitcoin. So today what we're going to be touching on is a couple of things just to get a sense of scale, fairly big picture. These are not perfect calculations, but they're really trying to get us within a plus or minus 10% ballpark. So we can at least answer the question, do we have to factor out GBTC? Or in many ways, is it functioning, at least in my opinion, from my study? I personally believe GBTC is functioning almost exactly the same as long-term holders spending in every previous cycle. And we'll talk through more of that as we get there, but that's kind of the context and the framework. So we'll look at things from the overall trade volume. We'll compare futures, spot, and the ETFs. We'll look at GBTC sell side and compare it to long-term holders. And we'll also look at the ETF inflows. Just, on the positive side, we've got coins obviously being acquired by the other ETFs outside GBTC. How much of the market are they really dominating? How big are they relative to everything else that is going on? Now, as always, please do give us a like, a share, and a subscribe. As I mentioned, this is a new channel, really us trying to grow our audience and trying to just show people how we can use on-chain and market data to really explore Bitcoin at a fairly deep level, right? We have such a plethora of amazing data for Bitcoin. It's really an opportunity for us to study this thing and really get rid of all the noise. There's a lot of narrative and try and bring it back to what is really happening on chain, what is happening in the markets, and put a bit of data-driven basis behind our conclusions, right? Let's get stuck into the analysis. Okay, so where we're going to start here, we're going to be starting on Check on Chain, and what I want to load up is our Bitcoin ETF metrics. We're going to look at a couple of these. There's a few different insights that we'll go through, but just getting a bit of a broad picture. So I want to start with the ETF balances. I'm going to load it up in BTC and USD. In particular, we're going to focus on GBTC for those. When we look at the daily net flows, these are the coins going in or out, or the dollars going in or out of the ETFs. We're going to put up the USD version of this. I want to quickly touch on the ETF price and volume just to kind of set the scene of what's going on. And then we'll do a comparison of futures, spot, and ETF volume, as well as a bit of a comparison of the overall ETF market size. So we'll look at these in sequential order. Okay, so starting with our Bitcoin balances, this is the BTC. Really, the picture here I think is relatively clear. We've got GBTC, which has been in just outflow mode only. And the outflows that we're seeing are in the several $100 million a day. So fairly significant outflows, and it has been persistent. Now, overall, you can see that the balance in these ETFs has in fact increased over time. So there has been net buy side, full stop. But we can also see that GBTC has declined from something on the order of 619,000 Bitcoin when the ETFs actually went live on the 11th of January, down to 323,000. So that is an enormous amount of coin. Quick math would tell me it's something on the order of about, 300 and something odd thousand Bitcoin, maybe just shy of that. Almost 300,000 Bitcoin has flowed out of GBTC. So this is substantial. I mean, that is more than 1% of the 21 million, right? That'd be 210,000. So there's been a huge amount of coin flow out of GBTC over just a handful of months. Now, if I stick this onto the USD basis, this is where things actually get really, really interesting. Bitcoin's had a pretty good year. It's rallied from about 42,000 at the start of the year. We're currently hovering around 71, 72 at the moment. So GBTC, when they opened, when all these ETFs went live, $28.7 billion, right? So that's what we're looking at here is the AUM. All the other ETFs had pretty much nothing, right? They started inflows, but you can see that they've all swelled up to be pretty significant. But we can see down the bottom here that GBTC, so 28.7, now we're at 23.1. Now, this is after losing 300 odd thousand Bitcoin. So an enormous amount of the coin supply has actually flowed out of GBTC, and yet they still have an AUM that's just a couple of $1 billion underneath their starting point. I think this really goes to show just how enormous the price performance has been, right? I mean, here's a fun fact. Bitcoin, the market cap was $320 billion back in January 2023. We've added $1 trillion of market cap in just over, about 18 months or so. So a pretty impressive, Bitcoin's price has been really quite extraordinary. The sheer scale of these numbers is quite hard to get your head around. But and this is actually relevant for the halving, by the way. My take on the halving is it has more of an impact if price is higher. I mean, this kind of sounds intuitive, but some people don't quite think about it this way. Yes, we get a reduction of 450 Bitcoin, but if the Bitcoin price is 50K versus 100K, that price change will more or less offset it. So even though GBTC has had 300,000 Bitcoin flow out of it, its AUM is only down by, what is it, almost 10% or so. So it's a pretty remarkable scale in terms of how much coin has to flow out. And yet we've still got $23 billion worth of AUM sitting in the GBTC. Now, the trade-off here is that GBTC can only sell these coins once, right? All the investors, they slowly move out. This is a one-time affair. But really, we are seeing a huge amount of supply coming back onto the market, and the market just has to absorb it. We can see a lot of it's gone into the ETFs themselves, but this is non-trivial sell side, right? So this is kind of building up to, is GBTC different to long-term holder supply? Now, if we look at things in terms of the flows, this is just something I really wanted to highlight. We obviously had, and there's no question, these ETFs have been absolutely incredible in terms of their scale and just what they've achieved, like just the sheer magnitude of them. It certainly blew away my estimates by probably about 10x. So really quite extraordinary. Here is where we started setting the 73K all-time high, and we've been consolidating ever since. We'll check the price chart in just a second. The first observation here is that the ETF flows have slowed. Certainly on the inflow side of the equation, we've had a slowing down of overall ETF inflows into all the other ones. They're still significant, right? On a weekly basis, we're getting a net flow of 484 million, 845 million. Granted, that comes after an 890 outflow. So that's what these little circles are here on the right-hand axis. They're basically looking at the weekly sum, just a quick, it's tiring of doing quick math. So I put these little bubbles here just to tell us what the total weekly is. But notice that GBTC still retains 300 million outflows. Almost 200 million outflows. Yesterday, $303 million worth of outflows. So GBTC sell side is just this long-term overhang the market has to work through. Now, here's one thing. GBTC is going to be classified as long-term holder supply because it was acquired. Most of those coins went in somewhere around 2021. Now, sell side is sell side. Whether it's forced selling because of bankruptcy, whether it's somebody who's trying to get out of GBTC because they don't like the fee structure, somebody else still has to absorb those coins. So the more that I've thought about this problem, is GBTC different? I really just come back to not really, because in many ways that sell side has to be absorbed by somebody. It is still sell side pressure, whether it's a bankrupt estate or not, whether it's forced selling or not, someone's still going to buy those coins. So in that way, it's still functioning much the same way that long-term holder supply does. When we break all-time high, people start to typically take some chips off the table. This is a pattern that we've seen in every previous Bitcoin cycle. So GBTC in many ways is kind of just functioning much the same, but just keeping things in perspective, right? $300 million a day, and there's still $23 billion worth in the tank. Now, of course, these aren't going to get sold at the same time. I actually suspect that GBTC will be, it'll be distributing the whole way through this bull cycle would be my best estimate. So just before we get onto the size comparisons, because that's really the meat of what I wanted to go over today, looking in terms of price and volume, if we look at the overall volume of the ETFs, this is only trade volume of the ETF. So this is off-chain. This is only looking at the trade volume on the centralized exchanges, right? The New York Stock Exchange, where all of these ETFs are actually trading. We can see we've had a decline in overall volume, right? It goes alongside lower inflows coming in. We've still got GBTC, which is net sell side, but we've got a lower trade volume. Price is consolidating. So we can see that not only have we had a bit of a slowdown in the overall inflows, but we've also got a decline in the volume profile. So it kind of makes sense that Bitcoin is chopping around and consolidating and just, working off what's been a pretty tremendous year thus far, but it really aligns with a slowdown across the board, right? None of these things should surprise us. And the video we did the other week really covers a bunch of other factors that kind of indicate what's happening. So I think the big picture takeaway, just before we jump onto the market size, if you were to just look at these charts, you could probably say, well, the ETFs are clearly having a pretty big impact. They're non-trivial because volume slows down alongside the flows slowing down. Price then goes from rip-roaring to the upside to chopping around and moving sideways. So we can just intuit and say it's probably pretty likely the ETFs have a pretty decent / meaningful impact. And that's really what we're going to measure in this next section. So if we look at trade volumes, this is a good way to just frame things up. We're going to look at things from a trade volume perspective, and then we're going to do a little bit of, more deep analysis to really understand the size of it, the scale of it. If we look at things in terms of trade volume, so what we've got here is futures trade volume in the yellow, spot trade volume here in the orange, and we've got ETF trade volume, so that volume we looked at just before, down here in the blue. Sorry, let me just get this back down to 0. Now, you can obviously see that futures are much larger than both of them. And in fact, the spot market, let's just take our current day, $6.8 billion per day. Futures are doing something on the order of $41, $42 billion a day. So the spot market is somewhere between 15 and 20% in terms of scale relative to the futures market. Now, for the ETF trade volume, 3.1 billion versus 6.8, the ETFs typically fluctuate between around 40 and 50%. Now, we can also see that there's some weekend seasonality, right? This has always been the case for trade volume, but obviously the ETFs are quite literally closed. But all the market making and the buy side, the sell side, arbitrage, all of these things, there's going to be this seasonality that starts to come into things. But if we just look at it from a trade volume perspective, the ETFs are approximately 40, 50% as big on a trade volume basis of the spot market. And then futures are then not quite an order of magnitude, but 5x-ish larger than the spot market. So just putting things in a perspective on the trade volume angle. Now, this is really the one that I wanted to spend more time on, because this is, how do we really frame up how big the impact of GBTC and versus long-term holder spending? So what I'm going to do, I'm going to turn off the positive inflows. We're only looking at sell-side action here. Now, ignore the blue zones when it's above. That's basically long-term holders buying, holding, and coins going into long-term holder status. We're only really focusing on the right-hand side here. In the blue, what we're looking at is, in dollar value terms, how much is long-term holder supply declining? In other words, how much are they spending and releasing back into the market over a 30-day period? Now, at the peak here, $57 billion a month. Non-trivial, right? Not chump change. $51 billion a month. Right now, about $33.8 billion a month. So we're talking about an outflow from long-term holders somewhere between 50 and 30, let's call it $34 billion per month at the current rate. Now, some portion of this is absolutely GBTC, because those coins are long-term holder status. They were acquired in 2021. So let's look at the total outflows over that 30-day period for GBTC and compare them. So GBTC is seeing about $15.8 billion on a monthly basis, a rate of change, in terms of total outflows. So if we compare that 15.8 to somewhere, if we're looking at 34, or we're looking at something like 51, then GBTC is something on the order of maybe 30 to 45 odd percent, right? Depends where you want to measure it, but ballpark figures. So we're talking about between 30%, a third of the size of the long-term holder spending, and maybe up to about 40, 45%. So what that actually means is that if GBTC is 30%, just for round numbers, long-term holders are contributing about 70%. So that 70% is the classic Bitcoin market that we all know and love. And note that this is actually not dissimilar to the trade volume. So whilst there's been a whole lot of trade volume in the ETFs themselves, there's about double that going on in the spot market. Now, there's also going to be some of that spot volume that's associated with the ETFs, but that's on a net flow basis, not a total trade volume. Total trade volume is different to the net flow into the ETFs. But we're talking about a factor of about 2. So long-term holders still are contributing, in my opinion, a dominant majority of the sell side price action, even if we were to discount GBTC. Now, that's not to say that GBTC isn't an important factor. It absolutely is, but it's not the only factor. I think that's the big takeaway. So the final question, actually, before we go on to the final question, if we look at these little purple lines, see these tiny little purple dashed lines here? That's the mining issuance per day, right? We're talking about $1.9 billion over a monthly period. The halving is going to have a much smaller impact than any of this stuff, right? Just maybe back here in the quiet periods, absolutely. The halving actually would have had a much bigger impact back over in these periods of time. But quite frankly, long-term holder spending and the net capital inflows, which is what this orange curve is showing you, they're just much, much bigger, right? So when we're looking at the halving and issuance, it kind of disappears in a bull. In a bear market or a kind of uncertain recovery we had back in 2023, the halving has a much bigger impact because people just aren't really spending their coins as long-term holders. It's more accumulation. There's a whole lot of factors. So now let's look at the positive side of the equation. In terms of this is excluding GBTC, so only looking at the rest of the ETFs, how much capital have they taken in? So the net increase, getting rid of GBTC, because that's just net outflows. So at the moment, we're seeing $28.5 billion in monthly inflows into the ETFs. I mean, again, just staggering numbers, really quite mind-bending, the scale of this. So 28.6 billion odd dollars flowing in. Now here, you'll see me cover this all the time, right? You spend any time floating around this channel, you'll see I love the realized cap. I think it's such an incredible metric. There's so many great derivatives we can pull from it. I look at the change in the realized cap because coins are getting revalued from lower to higher cost basis. The change in the realized cap to me is a capital inflow because some guy's profit taking is another guy having to buy a coin at a higher price and inject more fiat than the original purchase price. So if we compare those two, right, the realized cap change is somewhere between $80 billion a month at the peak, down to about 52, and we're comparing that to about 28.6. So again, round numbers, the ETF inflows are contributing something on the order of about 40 to 50% of the overall capital inflow. So if we really just break that down and summarize what we've gone over, if we look at it from the perspective of trade volume, if we look at it from the perspective of long-term holders spending versus GBTC, or we look at it in terms of ETF inflows versus the realized cap change, we're talking about something in the order of about, let's say between 30 and 50%. So that is a dominant part of the market. It's not the only part. This is the big takeaway. The ETFs are massive. 30%, 40%, 50% are huge numbers of any market, but they're not 100%. We're still talking about 70 odd percent, 60 odd percent of long-term holders are the ones spending. So there is still profit taking by these long-term holders that is not associated with GBTC, and it is also meaningful and significant. So that's the big takeaway. It's a bit of an interesting study, and again, it's not perfect. We're really just looking at ballpark numbers here. We can obviously do a lot more detailed analysis, but hopefully this just frames things up, puts into a bit of perspective, and helps us understand how big the ETFs are anyway. So thanks for tuning in, folks. If you really enjoyed this video, do give us a like, a share, and a subscribe. It does help this channel get to more people. Let me know what you liked, what you didn't, anything you want to see in the channels, in the comment section below. Please let me know, and I'll catch you in the next one. Cheers.